Okay. Well, hello, and hopefully you're actually here because I know we had some technical problems to get you from Zoom, then over to live stream and onto here. So hopefully you're seeing me because I cannot tell actually how many there are. But Joshua is looking at some of the other parts thing. I think most of you are with me on live stream, which is awesome. So that is great. So here we are. It's Wednesday, November 10th. We're on Zoom. I wish you guys were here live because then I could actually look at this whole room here and see lots of you guys here, which would be great. I guess that'll happen in 2 weeks, but we're here. So I'm glad you joined us this evening. Hey, so my name is Mark Swatsky. I'm one of the table leaders. My table is normally in that corner over there, number 14. So a little bit about myself. I'm married and got 2 kids, 22 and 23 years old. And the main job that I do outside of here is I work as an accountant. But before I actually worked as an accountant, back in high school and university, my other job was as a swim instructor and a lifeguard. So what was interesting with that, because one of the highlights that I had with being a swim instructor was actually getting people to get over their fear of water and to just begin to swim. I mean, I did all the stuff from like little kids to the seniors and everything between, getting them to learn to float, getting them to, train better for triathlon, so everything in between. But the funnest part was with the ones where they go, you know what, I'm totally freaked out about the water. I want to learn how to swim, but how do I do this and get over my fear? And so what was great was having them come in the water, learn to trust me that, okay, I'm not going to let them drown. I'm going to be with them the whole time, and then help them learn to trust the water. Say, okay, that took some time. They had to sort of figure this out and learn and trust it, but I was with them the whole time. But it was really cool to see them going, I can't even go in the water or go under the water, but get them to the place where they can now go comfortably under the water, blow bubbles, move around, float by themselves, get up, all those things. But the whole thing was for them, do I trust Mark as my teacher? Will he stay with me the whole time? And also, can I trust the water? Is it always going to actually hold me up when I hold my breath? Can I float in this? So this was cool to see that change in them. For us, it's the same thing. I mean, a lot of us, one of my things is when my kids learn to drive, can I trust them with the family car? So I actually had to learn that and get over that to go, yeah, okay. It was a little bit, but I had to still trust them with that. And even now, they're still driving. I still have to trust them that they're not going to bang the car up. And for you too, it'll be with your kids or at work. Does your boss have your back when things are getting tough? Or, if you're a friend and you're telling them a secret or that some tough things in your life, will they blab with everyone else? Can you trust your friend? And that's the question that Israel has in this passage here with chapter 13 and 14 is, can they trust God? And then I'm going to use the phrase of, can they trust that God will stay in his lane? In other words, will God be the person that he said he is always, and can they trust him? So remember the context we have in all this is that the whole story from Genesis all the way to now, God was promising to Abraham and all his descendants, you're going to get a promised land. You're going to be a great nation. So all the way from Genesis to Exodus, with God's power pulling them out of Exodus, out of Egypt, out of slavery, all God's power. Great. Bring them over here to Mount Sinai, give them new laws, give them rules. This is how you interact with me as God. This is how you interact with each other. And tell them, okay, this is how you build the tabernacle, and this is now how you live with me in your presence. Great. And now, with all that, they did some moves out of Mount Sinai, and now they're right at the edge of the promised land. So now the question is, what now? Will Israel trust God to stay in his lane? So the question, what I've done here with this passage, it's a long passage, chapter 13 and 14, and many of us know this passage. It's quite a big, famous passage. So I've divided it into 2 parts, and the 2 parts are, the first part is stay in your lane or not. And this is from chapter 13:1 to the beginning of 14, and then I've got the second part is, well, God stays in his lane, or in other words, God stays true to his character. The second part starts where God starts talking with Moses, and the first part is everything before that. So what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to move the slide. So the first slide, just briefly, it shows where I'm saying stay in your lane or not, all of 13. So what's going to happen in this section, I'm just dividing this into 3 parts. So the first part, because I'm not going to read every word of this passage, but this first part now, what happens now is Moses, they decide on who's going to go spy, 12 elders, great. They're good people, they've got good reputations. We've only heard one of these guys before, Joshua. We haven't heard Caleb, we don't know the other elders. None of these guys, other than Joshua, was mentioned anywhere else in the books. So these are new guys. Okay, great. They describe, Moses says, okay, go up the land, explore it, check it all out, see if it's fortified, see if there's lots of people, how are they walled cities or not. So the spies did know that the land was going to have people. It wasn't going to be empty. It wasn't going to be a piece of cake. And even before this, God had spoken to Moses saying, I'm going to give you the land that have all these people in there. So it wasn't a surprise. So none of that should have been a surprise. And if you trust Google Maps, roughly, when you look at the maps, it's roughly 500 kilometers north, and then coming back another 500. It would probably take, 8 hours a day of walking. It should take 25 days to do it all. So 40 days is totally possible. So let's go into the next passage. I'll switch to the next slide here. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to be reading some of this. I'm going to be highlighting some of these parts. So this is now, as I said on the top, what does it look like to not stay in your lane? So now in verse 13, verse 25, at the end of the 40 days, the spies returned from spying at the land, and they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness at Paran at Kadesh. Again, just on the south side of Israel. They brought back word to them and all the congregation. Again, this is all public. They weren't just doing it inside the tabernacle where it's all private. And they showed them the fruit of the land, and they told them, here are the spies. They're all saying this, we came to land which you sent to us. So we came to the land which you sent to us. And it does flow with milk and honey. And again, this milk and honey, this land, God had mentioned this phrase several times, milk and honey. So again, the spies then knew, yes, we went into the land. This is the land that God did promise, and we saw it. And here's the fruit. So this is proof. And then we keep going. So they saw the fruit. However, and this is now the first part where they're saying, hey, they've got some doubt now. There is some doubt, and if you can actually read those words, that's good on you. The people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Again, this shouldn't be a surprise. They knew there were people there in their country and their cities there. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there and the Amalekites as well in the land of the Negeb. And the Hittites and Jebusites and Amorites dwell in the hill country. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. None of this is a surprise. They all knew that all these people would be here. It's not something that was hidden from them from Moses at all. So, okay. But what we're seeing here now is that they are expressing doubt. Then we go to the next section. Now Caleb tries to slow them from not crashing out of their lane, because I'm defining that the people should be staying in the lane, meaning they should be believing God and they should be obeying God. It's like one of those bumpers, like when you play bowling and you're playing with your little kids, and the 2 gutters on the 2 sides, and you don't want to fall off on either side, so they've got the 2 gutters filled with these rubber mats so that the ball stays in the middle. So the thing is, you got believing on this side, obeying on the other side, and you want to stay inside. So I'm trying to say that the Israelites, they're supposed to stay in their lane, but right now these spies are crashing out of that. So Caleb, he tries to convince them, let's go up and occupy it. But the men, the other 10, they say, now notice the big focus of what they're talking about. Caleb was very confident, but the spies now are saying, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. And they brought to the people a bad report. They said, the land which we have gone to spy out, is a land that devours its inhabitants. And the people that we saw are of great height, so they're huge. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak who came from Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. This whole passage, they don't mention God. They don't mention God's power, God's strength, God's promise. It's all us, us, us. We are the ones we saw it, which is true, but we are now all small. We're little grasshoppers and everyone's big. I mean, they even ramped it up and saying this land devours the inhabitants. I mean, the spies were just there in the land. They got out. It's like, what's the problem? They were not devoured. And then they mentioned this Nephilim. And the commentary doesn't say too much about, well, who are they? But there seemed to be some talk about maybe there were some sort of mythological creatures or, somehow maybe fallen angels or some sort of myth about that. So now it's almost like these guys are amping up their disapproval, and this land is so bad that they're even bringing in Marvel comic, supervillains to make it so bad, to so convince you not to go in. So that's a bad thing. So they haven't mentioned God at all. Then we go to the next slide. So we just had the spies saying, okay, we're going to crash out of this lane. We're not going to believe God. So now we have the congregation. They've now come in and said, they've got a loud cry. They weep and they grumble. And we know what grumbling did. They just saw that just recently against Moses. Because remember, just last chapter, Aaron and Miriam, they were complaining against and grumbling against Moses. She had leprosy. They had to wait 7 days. These people don't have a very long memory. They still grumbled against Moses and Aaron. So the whole congregation said, oh, it would be better if we died in the land of Egypt or died in the wilderness. And why is the Lord? So first they were showing disapproval and saying, leaders, you're bad leaders, we don't believe you. Next, they're even amping it up to say, God, you are not a good leader. And then now they're saying, well, our wives and our little ones will become prey. Let's go, Egypt is better. Let's go back to Egypt. Somehow again, they have listened to the 10 spies that said, we are so small. They've completely ignored everything of what God can do. And they thought in this case that it would be better to go back to Egypt with slavery instead of the promised land. The next slide here talks about, well, what does it look like to stay in your lane, to believe and to obey? So Moses and Aaron fell on their feet before the assembly of the congregation of the people of Israel. And Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes. I mean, this is dramatic. This is, they're seeing this such a horrible treatment of what they're doing to God, of rebelling against them. And now it's likely Caleb had speaking. It's Caleb or Joshua, but likely Caleb, because Caleb spoke last time. But notice now the direction of what Caleb and who Caleb is talking about now. The land which we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. It is. He saw it as well. But he now looks at, if the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land, and he will give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people, for they are just bread, like they're chaff, they're dust, they're not going to get anywhere, it's no big deal. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Don't fear them at all. A big difference here, Caleb is saying, he knows there's obstacles. He's not fooling himself to say these people aren't in fortified cities, that there aren't big armies. He knows that. But his eyes now are on God. His eyes are on God's power, God's ability to do this, and he's remembering what God has done in the past. The spies, the other 10 spies in Israel is completely forgetting that and looking at themselves as very, very little, and they're ignoring the big God who has brought them to this spot. But even after all this, the spies and Israel, they won't even just stone Moses. It's like, no, this is not it. We don't trust you. We don't trust God at all. So then the question is we read that whole passage, we get to this whole first section of what does it look like to stay in your lane or to not stay in your lane? And the Old Testament reader, they would remember, okay, so God has been teaching Israel throughout all these books right up till here is, well, how to have a relationship with him. He brought them out of Israel, put the tabernacle in the middle. We talked about all the tribes around and all the interaction of how to do that. And God was showing all the way through that he stays in his lane. This is who he is. He makes promises. He keeps those promises. So Israel should obey. And if they aren't obeying, there will be curses and there will be suffering. And so the Old Testament reader, I mean, they could have been in, they could have already been in the Promised Land. They could have been in the good times with King David or King Solomon, or in the bad times, like when they were now exiled because of their disobedience. But they read this now and they go, oh, this is another example of the people falling out of the lane, not believing, not trusting God. And this reader is going to look back and say, oh man, we've done it again. Someone's going to get hurt. These guys are going to get punished for this. They should have stayed in their lane. So what about us now? So for us now, we don't have the tabernacle. We don't have Moses, Levites, the priests. We don't do the sacrifice. We don't do the wave offerings, any of those sorts of things. So now for us, we now have Christ who lived. He died. He was resurrected. So now because of that, there's a whole new way of us to actually have a relationship with God. So the question now is, we saw how the Israel did it. We saw how the Old Testament reader would look back and say, yeah, they should have stayed in their lane because God is staying in his lane. Connecting with us, when I go to my next slide here, is also for us, we're also supposed to believe and obey. So how do we have a relationship with God now? Well, it's only through believing in Jesus. So for instance, how to stay in our lane? Well, we need to believe. And these are some of the core parts to say, well, am I a Christian? Is we actually need to believe that we have sinned. In other words, we've done wrong and we haven't done all the right things that we're supposed to. And then therefore, we're actually apart from God. We're not close. And then the cost of our sin is actually death. And then only because of Jesus that we can actually have this relationship with God fixed. And then with that, then we have to then say, to have this relationship, we have to say, yes, I believe these things. Yes, I believe that Jesus is the only one who can fix this relationship between me and God. And it's just a little side note, all those passages are from Romans. So if you ever actually want a help to say, well, how do I describe this to some people? If you ever just Google Roman road, like salvation and Roman road, there's a number of verses in the book of Romans that says, well, how do you walk through this one book and show someone how do they become a Christian to believe to become a Christian? So that's where all these verses are coming from. But there is this important part in the bottom where I say, there's the and. Because now when you believe that Christ is the only one who can fix our relationship with God, there is the resulting part, which is we also then need to obey. So for instance, we want to, like we saw on page 64, like if you got to page 64 of the books, we talked about we then need to obey his commands. In other words, love your neighbor, love other Christians, which means we abide in Christ. We also then bear fruit. And then because of loving your neighbors and your Christians around you, that will actually prove that we actually believe and are believers. So it's the and. We can't do just one or the other. So this is how we would then stay in our lane. So I'm going to move back to this slide here. And for myself, one example that I had in my own life that was, it was a hard one. It took a lot of years. It was a hard one. Seeing where a person, they wouldn't believe us as a family, and they kept doing things that hurt them. And this example was of my mom. My mom was a closet alcoholic for a whole bunch of years. It was only when I was in like my early 20s I actually realized she was an alcoholic. Because she didn't have bottles in front and all that kind of stuff, because some people are alcoholics that are very visible. She was it was all closeted, never saw it. But both my parents, were Christians. They were involved in the church, did lots of good things. You couldn't really see it out front, but after a while we noticed things were going on. And then after a while we would, there's 4 of us kids, so there's me and there's a brother and 2 sisters. With our siblings, we're going, well, how do we deal with this? How do we work with my mom and my dad? We loved my mom, but we really hated this, and this was tough because it made our relationship tougher, it made it more distant, but we still loved her, and we wanted her to get help, we wanted her to step out of this. But for whatever reason, For a long time, she didn't believe that she had a problem. She didn't believe that it was a difficulty for the family. She didn't think she was an alcoholic. And she kept going back to this in slavery of her Egypt of alcohol. And that was really tough. But we still loved her. We still cared for her. And we wanted her to believe, hey, Mom, we will love you even as you're an alcoholic, but we love you so much that we want you to get help. We want you, we'll still love you because even as you struggle to get better, we're going to love you through all that. But somehow she wasn't believing that. She wasn't believing that God would help her through this. And so what happened, she kept going back to her, to the alcohol, which was tough. It took a long time. Eventually, thankfully, to give the good news, is she did eventually go to rehab and become sober, which was great. But that's a whole bunch of years to get there as well. But we can be in the same place as well, where we might be also stuck in the place where we're doing things that are wrong, that are bad for us. I mean, there's the obvious ones we always talk about. Well, are you involved in porn all the time? Are you total workaholic? You're drinking too much? Neglecting your family? Those are the obvious ones, but they're hard as well. That can make a big impact on you, yourself, your family. But there's also, what about things when we're not doing the good things? We're not doing the good things, and we're just wasting time. I mean, right now on COVID, isn't that so easy? Streaming services everywhere. And we may not be watching really horrible things. We may be watching amazing documentaries and learning all sorts of things. But it might be just taking and distracting us from, oh, my kid's having a tough time at school, but I've ignored him again. Or my wife is, there's things happening with her family, and I really should be helping and supporting her. Or, hey, another person needs help, moving their household. Or, could we be spending time reading the Bible and actually encouraging ourselves and encouraging others of who God is? So sometimes we can be stuck in both those things, doing the bad, which hurts us, or just not doing the good. So what do we actually do? So one of the passages that I know you might have hit in the Gospel Connections is in Hebrews. So here, I'm just going to pull out 4 things. There's a bunch more, but I'm going to pull out 4 things in here. So the question here is, how do we stay in our lane to believe and obey? So I'm going to say here, as we're going through that, well, first, take care, brothers. In other words, be attentive. Be aware. Look at this. Don't be distracted from it. Lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart leading you to fall away from the living God. But exhort. In other words, encourage, remind, urge, each other every day, as long as it's called today, so that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. So, we want to make sure we take care that we're not being deceived, and exhort each other so we don't fall into this deceitfulness of sin to say, oh, it's not a big deal. I'll watch TV for a few more hours and a few more hours tomorrow. I'll watch sports for 3 hours today, another 3 hours tomorrow, and every other day of the week. But hey, remind each other. So then we go on a little further to say, for we have come to share in Christ, if indeed we hold our original confidence in him to the end, that today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as it is in the rebellion. For who were those who he heard and yet rebelled? Was it not all those who left Egypt, led by Moses, and with whom was he provoked for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest? In other words, the promised land. But to those who were disobedient. So we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. So for us, the big things I said, take care, exhort, so that you don't get deceived by sin, and also so that you don't fall to unbelief. So the next part, the next section, first section was all about, okay, people of Israel, will you stay in your lane? In other words, will you believe and will you obey and will you stay inside that? The second part here is, well, God will always stay in his lane. In other words, he's going to stay true to his character. He's going to stay within those bounds to say, yeah, this is who I am, this is what I do, and I'm always going to stay within that. So here, there's a number of parts, so I'm going to check this first one out here. So let's read this. This is a tricky one. This is a hard one. There's lots of different ways that people have looked at this one, so let's read it first. But the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the people of Israel. So in other words, everyone is seeing this. God has appeared again. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will this people despise me? How long will they not believe in me, despite all the signs that I have done among them? I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them, and make you a nation greater and mightier than they. So it's a tough one because, you wonder, well, did God change his mind? Was Moses so brilliant in his persuasion that he somehow astounded God that, I didn't think of that point. I'm gonna change my mind. Let's do that. Thank you, Moses, for raising that up. I didn't realize that. So how do we wrestle with this here? Because that doesn't make sense, because God is the one who's, he knows all things. He knows the past and the future. He knows what's going to happen. He knew Israel would have this response to the promised land. And also when we look at, even a little bit further, when we get to Numbers 23 and James 1, it's said there several times, God does not change his mind. So how do we hold that? God doesn't change his mind, but he seems to sort of change his mind just a little bit. Like, what's the deal? So what is the answer? I mean, it could be where one of the ways that I was thinking through this was, it's a little bit like saying, hey, me and my family, we're driving to Interior, we're going to go on holidays. The kids are totally bickering in the back. They're totally having all sorts of fighting in the back. And it's like, this is a pain. We've been waiting so long for this holiday. We tell the kids, okay, if you don't start arguing or stop arguing, like, we're just going to stop this car. We're just going to go right on back home and head back. And in your mind, you're wanting to keep going on holidays, and you're expecting the kids that on that threat, they're going to start behaving and then keep going and say, okay, well, then we'll keep going. So that's how I'm reading this, to say, well, God is actually prompting Moses to say, okay, Moses, I'm going to make this big motion to say I'm going to disinherit them, destroy them. And he actually said this once before, at least, and this is when the golden calf incident came up. If you want to call that the scandal, how would you call that, the golden calf-gate? I'm not sure what you want to say that, but that one happened. God there again also said he was going to destroy them and start again. And so here again, it was so serious that God, he was prompting Moses, okay, Moses, what are you going to do? But it is a mystery. God doesn't change. He seems to relent. He doesn't totally relent because he still actually judges them, and he does actually destroy, like all the ones over 20, they all die. So there is still judgment. But yet he still is prompting Moses, I want you to intercede. Like, if you care so much for these people, intercede and to pray. And so Moses does. So what Moses then does, he goes on. In the next parts, he starts saying, God, this is who you are. And Moses now says to God, and look at now, the whole time Moses, in this whole discussion, he's not saying, hey, do these things because Israel is they're such an amazing people. It's like, no, it's all about God. But Moses said to the Lord, but Lord, the Egyptians will hear of it, for you brought up this people in your might from among them. They will tell the inhabitants, and they will tell the inhabitants of this land. They have heard that you, O Lord, are in the midst. In other words, your fire, your smoke, you're right here. You're not like an idol. For you, O Lord, have been seen face to face, and your cloud stands over them, and you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Now, if you kill this people as one man, then the nations who have heard your fame will say, because the Lord is not able to bring these people into the land that he swore and to give them, and instead he killed them in the wilderness. So here, Moses is going all the way through. He says, okay, God, your actions all the way through, you were powerful, you brought them up, you're different from the gods of Israel or from the gods of Egypt. This is who you are. You showed this in your actions. Then Moses goes on, okay, let's look at your character. So now this next part, Moses again points only to God. He says, let the power of the Lord be great, And part of this power is his character that he has, which is slow to anger, abounding, like not just a little chintzy little love, but he's abounding in steady, constant, regular love. He forgives, but he's no means will clear the guilty. In other words, there will be justice. He doesn't overlook that. Visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and the fourth generation. So God, because of your actions that show that you are that you are staying in your lane, and because of your character, please pardon these people of Israel, according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt until now, which he has. He's done several times. He's forgiven them. And again, Moses is looking all to God to saying, he's not mentioning at all about how good or important or vital or special or unique the people of Israel. It's all God's character. And one thing with this too is Moses is quoting back to God. Well, God, this is what you said when at the time around the golden calf. This is who you are. This is how you revealed yourself, God, to me as Moses. And I'm bringing this back to say, yeah, this is how you've shown yourself. So based on this, show yourself to be faithful. Because you look in this list again, it's the exact same thing. God is merciful, gracious, slow to anger, steadfast love, forgiving, and no means clearing the guilty. It's so important. He's bringing this verse up again to God. Then we go to the next part. There's a whole, so I'm now taking the verses right to the end. I'm not going to read everyone, but what we had first, we had Moses describe, God, this is your character, and this is your actions that show who you are. Now, God shows again by his character and by his actions, yep, I'm staying in my lane. Because as verse 20 and on, God forgives Israel, he judges, he shows love to Caleb, he loves Israel, he judges Israel, and he shows love, and it keeps going. And then go to the next slide, where God, his actions again show that he's still staying in his lane, where he shows steadfast love to Israel, where even though they've done all these rebellious things, he's going to go with them as they wander for 40 years. He's going to be with them, but he's going to judge. And he's faithful to Caleb and Joshua, saying, you trusted me, you're going to get on the promised land. And then the very last part of the passage where the Israelites, they go, oh, sorry, okay, God, we repent. We recognize we did wrong. Okay, we'll go into the promised land now. You want us to go into the promised land? We'll go now. But now it's disobedience. They weren't supposed to go in now because God said, no, it's too late. Turn around, go back, and wander for 40 years. So God still judged them. He followed through, and they didn't actually make it into the promised land. And they fell in battle there. So here, when we get to this part now, we've done these whole two sections. Israel, stay in your lane, believe and obey God. And God always stays in his lane. The readers would go, yeah, this reminds me, God does stay in his lane. He's powerful, he's slow to anger, he's steadfast love. They've seen this from Genesis all the way through. So yeah, so you're supposed to choose then. Do you believe and obey? Or do you not obey and suffer consequences as the readers would see? And what about for us now? Well, for us now, we're not wandering around the lands of Egypt and Israel, but for us, as we go to the next slide, we realize that Jesus is God. And there's some passages here that I've quoted from John 1 saying, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He, Jesus, was in the beginning with God. So Jesus is God. And Jesus himself even says, I am, and I was before Abraham. So Jesus is calling himself, and he is God. Hebrews says, God doesn't change. Jesus doesn't change. Therefore, after all this, the God that we talked about in the Old Testament is Jesus still now, slow to anger, steadfast love, forgiving, but he'll still judge, and he wants a relationship with us. So what does this mean? So what does this mean? Well, God stays in his lane. We should as well. I know after a while you go, the Israelites should have figured that out. We should figure that out, but it's hard. But we somehow have to keep reminding ourselves. But it comes down to, who do we trust? So for instance, if you got a letter saying, hey, one of your uncles from Ontario died, left you $100,000. Hey, would you believe that letter? Well, what was interesting, and I know I'm not really that big on the screen, but so I guess it depends on who you get. But so here in Abbotsford, so here's a letter from a company called Lindley Wellwood. So some of you may have heard them, like they're an accounting for a law firm here in Abbotsford. You go, okay, I know them, I've heard of them. Okay, I've maybe had some dealings with them. Okay. And then, or on the other hand, like I get this other fax, and first of all, you can't trust it because you get a fax. Like who sends faxes? But this is also one from the Hawkins law firm in the UK promising me 13 million pounds if I help them, get this money from the UK over to here. I'm going, well, so which am I going to trust? The law firm that I know and I've seen, or am I going to trust Hawkins law firm that faxed me an email, like faxed me a note saying 13 million pounds? So it comes down to like, do I trust? And what do I do with it? I'm going to trust the law firm I know, not the one that just sends these random emails and faxes to everyone. So for us, how do we respond to all of these things, these two big passages? And we've heard these three words together, which it always helps remind me and encourage me to keep persevering as a Christian. Three things. We need to profess, we need to practice, and persevering. So in the language that I was using is, we need to profess, in other words, believe that God will stay in his lane and that he will save us as we profess that only Jesus can save. So that's the beginning. Great. Then after that, we then need to practice or obey, and that we believe that God, through his power, will grow us as Christians as we strive to believe and obey his commands and stay in our lane. Also knowing that when we fall, we make mistakes, we can ask for forgiveness and come back in the lane. When we make mistakes, we can come back in the lane and be forgiven, but we still strive forward. And then also lastly, that we persevere, that we continue believing that God will save us, transform us, all the way to our very end. So that's the big deal for us. Is the whole summary then is, stay in your lane. All of us here, all of you guys at home, everyone who's watching a live stream, stay in your lane, believe and obey God. Well, why? Well, because you can trust him. You can trust that God will stay in his lane and be always the same God that he has promised to be. Thanks very much. And I think there's a handout that was emailed to you guys. You can get that connection if you want to pull that out. When you go back in your small groups, you could work through that. And thanks very much.